In the year 1482, over the cobbled streets of Seville, church bells echoed through the misty morning air like a warning meant to burrow into the minds of the faithful. The Spanish Inquisition had only recently been established, but word of its growing authority spread swiftly across the land, carried by frightened whispers in taverns and behind the thick stone walls of homes. In this atmosphere of fear, even silence was dangerous, for the absence of praise toward church and crown might be interpreted as defiance. Don Rodrigo de Torquemada, recently appointed Grand Inquisitor, had vowed to purify the kingdom of heresy. His presence was rarely seen, but deeply felt a cloak of unseen power draped over every church and public square. Priests preached about the dangers of false belief and the sacred duty to report any signs of deviance. On every street corner, public notices proclaimed the church's sacred right to investigate and punish disobedience in the name of God. In a small house near the eastern gate, Isabel Alvarez clutched her rosary and stared at her wooden door. Just the previous night, her neighbor Diego Sanchez had been dragged from his bed after being accused of secretly practicing Judaism. Nobody had seen him since, and nobody dared to ask where he had been taken. Isabel's heart pounded as she remembered how kindly Diego had once shared bread with her family. Now his kindness had become a crime. Across town, the Monastery of Saint Mary had been transformed into the Inquisition's tribunal headquarters. Its once peaceful courtyards were now patrolled by armed guards. Torches burned even during daylight, illuminating the long stone corridors where suspected heretics were dragged to be questioned. Within these walls, every footstep echoed with dread. Rooms that once housed monks and scriptures have been emptied to make space for torture chambers prepared with chains, racks, and devices forged by blacksmiths loyal to the crown. Brother Mateo, a young friar, walked the halls carrying a stack of parchment and ink. He had joined the church to serve God in silence and prayer, but the Inquisition had turned his faith into an instrument of fear. As he passed one chamber, he paused when a muffled cry seeped beneath the heavy iron door. His fingers tightened around the parchment. For a moment, he considered walking away. But just as he turned, an older monk stepped into the hallway. "Brother Mateo," the monk said, his voice calm but firm, "the Grand Inquisitor requires your presence. Take these records to the tribunal room. These names must be read and announced today." Mateo swallowed hard and nodded. He took the scroll and made his way through the cavernous halls until he reached the main tribunal chamber. Within, high-ranking clerics sat behind a long wooden table, their faces stern and unmoving. A large crucifix hung above them, casting a dark shadow across the room. Kneeling before them were several accused citizens' men and women clothed in chains. The room smelled of incense and sweat. At the center sat Torquemada himself, his dark robes embroidered with gold, his eyes sharp and unyielding as he listened to the testimonies being read aloud. As Brother Mateo stepped forward, Torquemada gestured for silence. "Read the next name." Mateo unrolled the parchment. His hands trembled as he spoke. Isabel Alvarez, accused of associating with known Judaizers. A gasp rippled through the chamber. Isabel, who had been pulled inside moments earlier, fell to her knees. "I have done nothing but serve the church faithfully," she cried, her voice shaking. Torquemada's voice was cool and measured. "Your proximity to heretics is itself a sign of suspicion. Mercy is offered only to those who confess." Tears streamed down Isabel's face. "Please, I am innocent." Torquemada gave a subtle nod. Two guards stepped forward and dragged her toward the nearby chamber. The heavy wooden doors slammed shut behind her. For several long moments, the chamber fell silent, save for the faint crackling of torches along the walls. Inside that dim chamber, inquisitors prepared their instruments. A large wooden rack stood in the center, flanked by iron chains and pulleys. As Isabel struggled to breathe, the senior interrogator stepped forward, his eyes devoid of tenderness. "Confess your heresy and spare yourself greater suffering," he demanded. "I have nothing to confess," she pleaded. The interrogator raised his hand. Two assistants forced her onto the rack and secured her wrists and ankles with coarse rope. The mechanism groaned as the wheel turned, stretching her limbs slowly and painfully. Her scream tore through the stone walls, twisting down the corridor. Brother Mateo closed his eyes, unable to block out the sound. He silently mouthed a prayer, though the words felt hollow. The tribunal continued its work as though her cries were nothing more than background noise. Hours later, after multiple interrogations and unbearable torment, Isabel's voice had been reduced to a faint whisper. She finally yielded. I confess," she sobbed, though her words carried no true admission, only desperation to escape the pain. The interrogator leaned in. "You confess to practicing Judaism?" "Yes," she said through trembling lips. With that single forced admission, the tribunal had what it needed. Isabel was returned to her cell, where she collapsed onto the straw-covered floor. Outside in the courtyard, a scaffold was being built. Word spread among the citizens that a public execution would be held at dawn. The following morning, the townspeople gathered in the square. Some came out of fear, others out of morbid curiosity. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, while men stood silently, their eyes fixed on the wooden platform. A large banner bearing the cross of the Inquisition fluttered in the breeze. Isabel, dressed in a simple white garment symbolizing her supposed crimes, was led to the platform with shackled hands. Torquemada stood at the edge of the platform, reciting a prayer that spoke of divine justice and the salvation of souls. When the prayer ended, the executioner stepped forward. The air was thick with dread as Isabel was bound to the stake. In one final desperate breath, she cried out, "May God forgive you all." But her words were swallowed by the roar of flames as the pyre was set alight. Cries and prayers rose from the crowd. Some crossed themselves, others turned away in horror. Yet none dared to speak against the spectacle, for fear that they might be next. And so, in the name of faith, the fire burned brightly, an unholy beacon of obedience. Brother Mateo watched from the monastery doorway, his heart heavy with doubt. He clutched his rosary, but for the first time in his life, he questioned whether God truly sanctioned such cruelty. As the flames licked the morning sky and the acrid smoke drifted over the city, the Inquisition's power tightened like a chain around every man, woman, and child in Seville. The terror had only just begun. The burning of Isabel Alvarez cast a long and terrible shadow over Seville. For weeks afterward, the smell of smoke still seemed to linger in the air, creeping into alleyways and clinging to the stone walls of the cathedral. People spoke more softly now. Even children lowered their voices when playing in the streets. Every chapel sermon warned of hidden unbelievers and the sacred duty to expose them, until suspicion began to bloom like a dark flower in every home. Inside the Monastery of Saint Mary, the halls of the Inquisition were busier than ever. A steady stream of prisoners passed through its iron gates: artisans, merchants, school teachers, even priests accused by rivals within the church itself. It no longer mattered whether these accusations had roots in truth. Once a name appeared on Torquemada's list, guilt became inevitable. In a vaulted chamber beneath the monastery, a new torture device was being assembled by blacksmiths who worked by torchlight. The device, a large iron cage, shaped like a coffin, had spikes fitted along its interior. The smiths called it the Iron Maiden, though it bore no resemblance to a saint. Its purpose was not piety but terror. When the cage was closed on a prisoner, the spikes pierced the flesh slowly, keeping the victim alive in indescribable agony. One afternoon, Torquemada descended the narrow stone staircase to inspect the new instrument. He moved silently, hands folded inside his sleeves, while 2 guards followed behind him with torches. At the foot of the stairs, the blacksmith stepped back and bowed. "My lord," one of them said, "it is complete." Torquemada stepped forward and ran a gloved finger along one of the spikes. "It will serve its purpose," he said quietly. "Make certain it is ready for the next interrogation." The blacksmith nodded obediently. That same day, a young scholar named Miguel Herrera was taken from his small apartment near the marketplace. He had been accused of possessing forbidden books volumes written in Arabic that had survived the Reconquista. His neighbors had reported him after seeing candlelight flickering late into the night and hearing strange phrases spoken in unfamiliar languages. It was enough to make him a heretic. Miguel was dragged into the tribunal chamber, his wrists bound with rough rope. Torquemada sat at the long table, flanked by stern-faced clerics who stared at the trembling scholar with thinly veiled contempt. "You stand accused of reading blasphemous texts and practicing infidel rituals," Torquemada declared. "Do you deny these charges?" Miguel shook his head desperately. "I swear by the Holy Virgin, I have studied only languages and history. I have no interest in forbidden faiths." "Knowledge can be a dangerous weapon," Torquemada replied, his voice cold. "It is not your place to question what the church has deemed unlawful." He raised his hand, and 2 guards seized Miguel by the arms. "Take him to the chamber. Let his soul be purified." Moments later, Miguel was dragged down the stairs and thrown onto the cold stone floor of the torture room. The door thudded shut behind him. The Inquisitor overseeing the proceedings stepped forward with the calm air of a surgeon preparing an operation. "Confess your heresy, and your suffering will be brief," he said. Miguel shook his head, tears streaking his cheeks. "I have no heresy to confess. Please, I beg you." Without another word, the Inquisitor signaled to the assistants. Miguel was forced inside the Iron Maiden. The iron door began to swing inward, its rusty hinges groaning like an ancient beast awakening from sleep. As the spikes pressed against his skin, Miguel screamed a sound so piercing it rattled the walls. The door closed slowly, inch by dreadful inch, until his screams turned into guttural cries and then into agonized wheezing. Brother Mateo stood in the corridor above, his hands clasped so tightly in prayer that his knuckles had turned white. Every cry from the chamber below made his faith waver. He had once thought the Inquisition a necessary shield against evil. Now he feared that the shield had become the very weapon it had vowed to destroy. Several hours passed before the Iron Maiden was opened again. Miguel's body, still clinging to life, slumped forward. Blood trickled from dozens of small wounds. The interrogator leaned close and gently lifted the scholar's chin. "Will you now confess?" he asked softly, almost kindly. Miguel gasped for air. "Yes, I confess. What do you confess?" The Inquisitor pressed. "That I read forbidden texts and doubted the Holy Church." The Inquisitor nodded once and stepped back. "Your cooperation will be noted." Miguel was carried to a nearby cell and left in darkness. He lay curled on the straw-covered floor, whispering prayers through blood-stained lips. Outside the door, 2 guards spoke in hushed tones about the next prisoner on the list. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the cathedral spires, a procession of horsemen arrived from Toledo. At their head rode Father Lorenzo, a senior emissary of the Inquisition. He carried with him sealed letters containing a new order from the crown. The search for heresy was to intensify. No region, no household was beyond scrutiny. The Inquisition's reach was to expand across the entirety of Castile and Aragon. Torquemada welcomed Father Lorenzo in the Grand Hall. They spoke quietly, their voices echoing beneath the vaulted ceiling. "The king and queen demand greater vigilance," Father Lorenzo said. "They fear that heresy may weaken the unity of Spain during this critical time." Torquemada nodded, his expression grave. "Then we shall give them vigilance. Send word to every tribunal. There will be no rest until every seed of doubt is extinguished." That night, riders were dispatched in every direction. As they galloped through villages and across moonlit fields, the people who heard the thunder of hoofs pulled their shutters tight and whispered hurried prayers. In Seville, Brother Mateo knelt alone in the chapel. A single candle flickered beside him as he stared at the crucifix above the altar. "Lord," he whispered, voice trembling, "grant me courage to do what is right. Help me to see your will through this darkness." But the silence that answered him was deep and unsettling. Far below, in the darkest depths of the monastery, the Iron Maiden stood empty, stained with fresh blood. Torches flickered against the walls, casting shadows that danced like demons waiting for their next victim. And outside in the silent streets, the people of Seville lived in constant dread, never knowing whether the next knock on their door would come from a friend or from the Holy Inquisition. By the winter of 1483, the city of Seville had become a place where even thoughts felt dangerous. A thick fog often drifted in from the Guadalquivir River and clung to the cathedral spires, as though God himself no longer wished to look upon what was happening in his name. Families prayed together at night, not out of devotion, but out of fear that their silence might be mistaken for doubt, and that doubt might lead to the dungeon. Inside the tribunal chambers beneath the Monastery of Saint Mary, Torquemada met with his trusted clerics to discuss a new strategy. Reports from neighboring provinces confirmed what he already suspected. Heresy was spreading in subtle, invisible ways. A careless word here, an unorthodox tradition there. It all signaled a wider infection. The Grand Inquisitor decided that fear alone was not enough. The people needed a reminder, a spectacle. At dawn the next morning, official proclamations were nailed to doors in every neighborhood. They announced that a grand public auto da fe and act of faith would take place in 3 days' time. A list of names followed, men, women, even a few teenagers, all accused of heresy or complicity in heretical practices. Their executions, the notice asserted, would serve as a warning and a purification of the city. In the marketplace, people gathered around the proclamations with pale faces. Merchants stopped weighing grain. Mothers pulled their children close. No one dared to remove the notices. No one dared to speak a word of protest. Brother Mateo read the list in disbelief. Near the bottom, he saw a name that made the breath catch in his lungs, Miguel Herrera. The young scholar, still recovering from the Iron Maiden spikes, was to be executed despite his confession. Mateo felt his heart twist. The promise of mercy, it seemed, had been nothing but a lie. That night, Mateo found Miguel lying in his cell, barely conscious. His face was gaunt, eyes sunken from days without food or water. He opened his eyes when he heard the friar's footsteps. "Brother Mateo," Miguel whispered. "Be still," Mateo said softly as he knelt beside him. He offered Miguel a small sip of water. "They plan to execute you in 3 days." Miguel swallowed painfully. "I confess, they promised I would be spared." Mateo's voice broke. "There is no mercy here." Miguel closed his eyes, tears sliding down his cheeks. "Then I will face death knowing that I never betrayed my faith." Mateo pressed Miguel's hand in silence. But as he left the cell, another dangerous thought began to take shape in his mind. Perhaps true faith meant standing against this cruelty. Preparations for the autodafe moved rapidly. A massive scaffold was erected in the main square, large enough to display the condemned in full view of the public. Banners bearing the cross of the Inquisition were hung from balconies. Soldiers patrolled the streets, ensuring no one interfered. On the morning of the execution, the people filled the square. Some came out of fear of being seen absent. Others came in eager obedience, convinced that they were witnessing holy justice. As trumpets sounded, the condemned were led out in a slow procession, each wearing a white robe with a red cross painted over the chest. Miguel walked among them, his steps unsteady, but his head held high. Though every movement sent pain lancing through his body, he refused to collapse. In the crowd, Brother Mateo stood hidden beneath his hood. He watched helplessly as the prisoners were lined up along the wooden platform. Torquemada stepped forward and raised a hand, calling for silence. "Brothers and sisters in Christ," he announced, his voice carrying clearly across the square, "today we cleanse our holy land of the poison that threatens our unity. These individuals have confessed a heresy, and by fire they shall be purified. Let their fate remind us all of our sacred duty." He motioned to the executioners. Ropes were tied. Tinder was stacked around the platform's base. The executioners lifted torches, the flames flickering in the cold morning air. Brother Mateo felt his heart hammering in his chest. He could no longer stand silent. Stepping out of the crowd, he raised his voice. "Stop!" The square fell into stunned stillness. Every face turned toward the young friar. Mateo's voice trembled, but he spoke with rising conviction. "This is not the will of God. These people do not deserve fire. They deserve justice and mercy. The Lord commanded us to shepherd his flock, not to burn it." A murmur spread through the crowd. Torquemada's eyes narrowed. "Brother Mateo," he said calmly, "you are misguided. The Holy Office acts on God's authority." "No," Mateo cried, stepping closer to the platform. "You act on fear. You twist the words of Scripture to justify cruelty. This is not faith, it is tyranny." Gasps rippled among the spectators. Torquemada lifted a hand, and soldiers rushed forward, seizing Mateo by the arms. But even as they dragged him away, his voice rang out again. "Do not let them kill in the name of God." For several heartbeats, the crowd hesitated. Faces turned toward the condemned, toward Torquemada, and then toward the burning torches. The executioners paused, unsure. Even the soldiers seemed momentarily frozen. But Torquemada's voice cut through the hesitation like a blade. "Light the fires." The torches were lowered. Flames roared to life, racing up the platform. Screams filled the air, blood-curdling and unbearable. Some spectators covered their ears. Others fell to their knees in shocked prayer. Miguel stood as long as he could, his face twisted in pain, before collapsing into the inferno. Brother Mateo watched in horror as the flames consumed the innocent. Before the heat overpowered him, he whispered a final prayer, tears streaming down his face. Torquemada turned away, his features unreadable. To him, this was but another step in the long march toward a purified and obedient kingdom. Long after the fires died, the charred scaffold remained, blackened and silent beneath the sky. People passed it with lowered heads, their hearts heavy with confusion and fear. No one spoke of Brother Mateo's desperate plea. No one dared say that perhaps he had been right. But deep within their souls, a seed of doubt had been planted. And though the Inquisition would continue for many years spreading to new towns, refining new tools of torment, something had changed that day in Seville. The people had seen that even faith could be twisted into a weapon, and that courage, though easily silenced, could still speak against the flames.